right, welcome everybody. All right, welcome and thank you for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Alan Levine. I'm CEO of Hasbara Fellowships. For those who don't know, we do pro-Israel work on college campuses, and we're active on 95 university campuses across the U.S. And Canada. And our purpose is to fight back against anti-Semitism and empower students to make the case for Israel and fight back against the propaganda that we see on too many college campuses. In our effort to do that, we take students to Israel every year. And while there, we teach them everything they need to know to come back to campuses as effective ambassadors and leaders. And we've launched these series here via Zoom that we call our leadership sessions to educate ourselves, keep ourselves up to date, and be able to engage in a dialogue here with some of our favorite educators and leaders and important minds that work on the issues that matter to us. And so today, it's my honor to welcome back Elliot Chodoff, IDF Major Reserve Elliot Chodoff, and also Professor Elliot Chodoff, who has also been one of my favorite educators that we've had with our students in Israel, really for many years, including most recently this summer. You were with us in Haifa in May, and you were with us on the bus actually for 2 days, educating our student leaders, Elliot. And so it's good to be able to talk to you here via Zoom as well.
Likewise, good to be with you.
Well, thanks, Elliot. And today, I want to jump into the topic at hand, which is the strike on Qatar, which okay. Last time we spoke here via Zoom, the topic was the 12-day war with Iran. And that was just earlier this summer. And now, obviously, it's all connected, but we're sort of looking at a different place on the map here. And what I think we're all wondering is, to what extent did this strike succeed in Qatar? I know we haven't seen public appearances yet from the two most prominent Hamas leaders, although there's mixed reports, and you'll tell us what you're thinking and what we should be looking for. But curious whether the strike succeeded, and also if you can just give us a bit of a briefing on what does this mean for the region. I know this audience reads a lot, so we know the basics, and more than the basics, but there's sort of a lot of talk whether Qatar is no longer going to be a mediator for the hostages here, whether this sends this. I've seen discussion in the media whether this Qatar was more the target here than Hamas, if that was the intention, to send a message to the Qataris, you don't host terrorists, right? So how should we be thinking about it? How are you thinking about it? Give us an overview.
Okay, well, all the indicators are that from a perspective of taking out the targets, the strike failed. Now, as you mentioned, the two most important ones, actually, there are a number of important, but let's say that the two top of the list, Khaled Mashal and El-Hia, who was Sinwar's deputy, are still undercover. They haven't been heard from, but all the word that's coming out, and of course, I should probably start with a caveat, and that is, take everything in public with a grain of salt. Statements, reports, there's always something behind the something behind. It doesn't mean they're necessarily false, but don't take them at face value. They could be hiding, they could be injured and not be able to move, and therefore want to keep their location secret. But all the indicators are of what's sort of bubbling out of the Israeli side of the system is that the strike failed to take out the targets that it was aimed for. Now, first of all, that raises a question, was it a bad idea? And I think here it's important for us to keep in mind that you can't measure the quality of a decision solely based on its outcome. In other words, you can have a very good decision and it fails. And when I teach decision making, one of the examples that I give is the game of blackjack 21, where if you have a 12, typically you would take another card. If you get a 10 or a picture, you lose. That doesn't mean it was a bad decision. It just means the outcome was bad. And you know that because if another 12 comes up under the same circumstances, you're going to make the exact same decision. And it may succeed. It's likely to succeed, but it can still fail. So the quality of the decision is not based on its success or failure. That's number one. Number two, there's been a lot of noise since the strike, and I'll get into some of the sort of the background and the context as well, but there's been a lot of noise, particularly in the media, particularly in sections of the Israeli popular political culture, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, that this was all done as a Netanyahu stunt in order to stay in office, torpedo the hostage deal, et cetera, the hit Bibi crowd. And here, just to be upfront, I'm neither part of the hit Bibi crowd, nor am I the I love Bibi crowd. I'm an analyst, and I've got my criticism. But in this particular case, we need to keep in mind that when the strike was publicized, virtually the entire mid-left through right of the Israeli political spectrum supported it. In other words, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, Bennett, Lieberman, who are all considered, well, Lieberman is sort of an interesting character, but the rest of them considered to be sort of to the left of the government, all came out and said this was the right thing to do. President Herzog, who was supposed to be apolitical, came out and said it was the right thing to do. And he even added a very interesting point, and that is that the talks were deadlocked. Al-Hia in particular was, what was the term that he used? A drop of poison in the talks. And it should be very clear, we were not on the verge of a breakthrough. More on that in a moment as well. So if the entire spectrum from center left to the right, including people with very good security credentials like Benny Gantz, come out and say this was the right thing to do, that kind of takes the wind out of the sails of the argument that this was done for purely domestic or personal political reasons. What are the positive aspects, or what are some additional considerations? Well, one is putting everybody on notice that we're going to go after terrorist leadership no matter where they are. Now, this shouldn't be a particularly outrageous or shocking statement. When America went after bin Laden in Pakistan, nobody questioned why America violated Pakistan's sovereignty in doing so. If anything, the question was, why is Pakistan harboring bin Laden? Here, of course, Israel is treated differently. We didn't strike Qatar as Qatar. We struck the Hamas leadership harboring in Qatar, and everybody sort of ignored that and said it was a violation of Qatar's sovereignty. The most amusing, of course, were the Iranians, who 3 months ago launched missiles into Qatar, but are condemning us for violating their sovereignty. So a lot of that kind of nonsense going on as well. The Americans certainly knew about it. There's no way that Israeli planes were flying anywhere in that vicinity without American air defenses having been alerted not to respond to them. Even if you think you can get away with it, you don't want to. The last thing Israel needs, the absolute last thing Israel needs, is to get into some sort of a friendly fire exchange with American air defenses, whether on ships or in Qatar itself. And let's keep in mind that the American Fifth Fleet is based there. So on that level, America knew. Rumors, did America tell the Qataris in time to tell the Hamas leadership to get out? I'm going to vote no on that one, and I'll tell you why. Among others, Al-Hia's son was killed in the strike. Now, it's hard for me to believe, even given the rather low interest Hamas leaders have in their children, I find it difficult to believe that the leadership left the room and left him behind to get killed. So I'm going to guess, and this is purely a guess, that basically what happened there was skittishness on the part of the leadership, some dumb luck, which counts for a lot. Napoleon, who knew a bit about war, said that I'd rather have a lucky general than a good one. Luck does count, and they got lucky. And we're not used to it because the strikes that we've done over the past year, and this is the anniversary of Beeper Day in Lebanon, the record between taking out Hania and the Hezbollah leadership and Hamas leadership in the course of the couple of years of the war, the Iranian leadership on the first day of the 12-day campaign, you kind of look and say, well, how did they miss this time? And the answer is, you know what? Even top ball players strike out on occasion, more than occasion. So the record is good, and an occasional failure. The saying in the IDF, the only people who never fail are the ones who never try. So none of that particularly concerns me or shocks me. The American response was interesting, typical Trump. I think that, first of all, the greatest sin of the strike was that it failed. If it had succeeded, I think he would have supported it wholeheartedly and taken credit for it. The fact that it failed, he now is caught in the kind of a vise between two American allies. Qatar certainly is not an Israeli ally, but it's an American one. And he's got a balance between the American relations with the two. So his speaking on the subject was mixed. Israel has to take care of, take out the Hamas leadership, but Qatar is an ally of ours, and that sort of back and forth, which didn't sound particularly good to the Israeli support crowd. But I'll say this as well, and this is an old lesson, particularly with the United States, and not just during the Trump administration. Any public statement, even a condemnation, that doesn't end with the words "or else," really doesn't mean very much. There's a lot of noise out there. That, I think, in the grand sense, is the best way to describe what happened. The most important positive aspect of it is the statement that shouldn't have had to be made, but it is, and that is, we will go after these people no matter where they are. Although I doubt if they were in Turkey, we would have done that. But they should know at least there's no place that is absolutely safe for them. They are on the list, and there's only one way off the list. And we're going to continue to go after you, which incidentally could explain why we're not seeing any of the survivors, again, not knowing who and how many and that sort of thing. These are not people, unlike the martyrs they send to kill themselves or into suicide kind of missions. These people are not interested in going to meet their virgins anytime soon. They're very, very, very careful about their own lives and safety, and they're being doubly so now, seeing that we had the chutzpah to go after them there. So I think that's a pretty good summary of the Qatar business and operation. Actually, I'll finish with saying, apparently Qatar is still interested in negotiating. Not surprisingly, they get extra brownie points, and they get to influence the outcome by being part of the mediation team between Hamas and Israel. In my personal opinion, we should ditch them and go only with the Egyptians, but nobody asked me.
Thank you. I a lot of questions, and I think we'll get to hostage talks in a minute too. But I kind of want to start with a big picture question, and something I've said,
Okay.
Since October 7th, as Hamas took all the hostages, and of course, Israel's been caught in this constant dilemma, right? Do you continue the war? Do you stop and negotiate for hostages? The two goals of total victory and the goal of bringing hostages back are not mutually exclusive, but they're not in concert either, right? Which I believe is a quote.
Certainly not simultaneously.
Right. And so, but I think a point I've made often is, well, we're not pulling all the levers here. We're not fully, we haven't explored all avenues with which to pressure Hamas because we're not pressuring Hamas and Turkey, sorry, Qatar and Turkey. And I've asked why many times, and we can get into why in a minute, but I mean, am I reading this right when I think, well, this is the first time that Qatar is on notice? I would think Turkey, there's a certain, they may have more protection being a NATO member, but I would think perhaps they're looking at this and thinking about how it could affect them. I think I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that aspect of it. But I guess first question is, I mean, is this really a game changer where, even if you're Qatar, you're not 100% safe if you're harboring terrorists?
I don't think it's a game changer. I think I would call it more of a shift. The fact that President Trump made very clear it's not going to happen again. Now, once again, with Trump, you never know. Is this a real statement? Is it a setup? Is it, if Israel does it again? In other words, if we get the lineup on targets in Qatar and we do it and succeed, does he then publicly criticize us and then go back to his office and call Bibi and say, "Nice shot, congratulations"? Impossible to tell with him. Mm-hmm. Turkey is a whole different story, by the way, not only because it's a member of NATO, it really is a serious power. Qatar can scream and moan and complain and convene a summit and talk all sorts of tough talk, but no, that crowd isn't doing anything. If we struck in Turkey, they have the wherewithal to come at us heavily. The Turkish Navy is very strong in the Mediterranean. It's got a reasonably powerful air force. It's got an army. It could turn around and try to invoke NATO, as Poland did last week. So I think Turkey's a whole different story for a whole bunch of reasons. Qatar, and by the way, the future of Turkey is still unclear. Erdogan is certainly tightening his grip and shifting far away from the secular Turkey of Ataturk after World War I, but he hasn't had the last word yet. There's still opposition. Turkey could turn. We don't want to turn it into an enemy any more than he has as a radical Islamist. Qatar is a hardcore Wahhabi Muslim Brotherhood operation, and that's deep in its unchanging ideology. In other words, as long as it's Qatar, that's what it's going to be. There's no alternative there. There's not going to be a revolution in Qatar. So two very, very different places. I would say, I think that, not, as I said before, not a game changer, but just another little twist in decision-making potential for the other side. Anytime terrorist leadership feels unsafe, it's a good thing for the Western world. It means even now they're in hiding. The reports are, and I can only go by the reports, they've distanced themselves from their cell phones. They're not in communication. They're not meeting. That already makes it difficult for them to run an organization. Now, how much does that matter in the short term with the operation going on in Gaza? Probably not that much. But still, sometimes you do things just because it's a good thing to do from a strategic point of view. And making it difficult for them to operate is just by nature a good thing without having to explain why.
Right. No, that makes sense, and definitely helps us think about how this pressures Hamas and I guess Qatar. Although Qatar, it sounds like with the president saying, this won't happen again. Perhaps the Qataris are not particularly going to be particularly cautious with giving Hamas safe haven going forward. I think.
No, I don't think they care, and as long as they have America's backing, they're going to do it. America pressured them a couple of times during the course of the war, and they said yes, 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 and they did nothing. Right. And frankly, America has very little to pressure them with at this point. America is tied into them very, very heavily, and would find it very difficult to cut Qatar off, and just say, if you don't do it our way, we're packing up all our toys and going home. America's not in a position to do that.
And I wanted to ask you why. You've mentioned that, I think it was last time we spoke here on the last leadership session that you were on. You mentioned that we didn't have a chance to get too deep into it, but I'd love for you to take us into the details on that. Why exactly? I think it's been maybe the most frustrating aspect of this for us as Americans. Most people on this call are Jewish Americans, certainly all pro-Israel Americans. Why is a U.S. ally harboring Hamas, just like Pakistan harbored bin Laden, right? And why do they have leverage on us? Shouldn't we have leverage on them with our base over there?
No, it's just the opposite. In that sense, very, very similar to the American-Saudi relationship. Now, the Saudi relationship has a lot to do also with the vagaries of the oil market and energy issues, but there's a tremendous parallel. The Saudis and the Qataris are the two Wahhabi states in the Middle East. The Wahhabis are hardcore radical Islamists on the one hand, but the Qataris came out of the Saudis. What the Saudis learned, what the Ibn Saud family learned from the beginning of the 20th century, and even a little bit before, in dealing with the British, is that they have to play essentially two games at once. One is a realpolitik facing the West and looking very moderate and modern sounding, not looking so much because they dress, hardcore Bedouin Middle Eastern, but make all the right noises to sound like we're really part of you. And there's a whole bunch of literature about observers in Saudi Arabia in the 1920s and 30s saying, these guys are radical Islamists and nobody sees it because they know how to serve coffee. And so the Wahhabi, the Qataris very similar to that in terms of their behavior. The West moved in there. They were very forthcoming. I mean, they've learned that it's almost a Godfather kind of strategy. I believe in friendship, and I believe in showing my friendship first. I'll give you universities money. I will allow you to set up a massive naval base. I mean, whatever you want, just ask. We'll be happy to give it to you, knowing full well that those things tie America in, and America can't just pack up the Fifth Fleet and say we're going somewhere else. Right. Establishing a base, a fleet base. I'm not talking about a visiting base where a couple of ships can go into. Is years and years and billions of dollars of investment that America simply, it can if it has to, but it's simply not going to walk away from on the vagaries of the immediacy of politics. The Qataris are playing the game. They gave Donald Trump an airplane that's actually in America now being set up to be Air Force One. I'd love to know where the microphones are. Real estate deals, we're really very good guys. And all right, so Al Jazeera in English is really pretty moderate. In Arabic, it sounds like the Muslim Brotherhood mouthpiece because that's what it is, and Hamas propaganda piece because that's what it is. But the average English speaker doesn't see it that way, and the average politician who's certainly lining their pockets, and I don't mean this in a bribery sense. I mean it in the sort of the way things work kind of sense, is not going to turn around and flip things over on, well, all right, so they've got a half a dozen Hamas guys in their luxury hotels racking up high bills and with portfolios of $5, $6, $7, $8, $10 billion. What's so bad? If they've got that much money, they can't be such bad guys either. So I think that's a lot of the kind of thinking that's going around in the background.
Right, makes sense. Very frustrating though, because we think back to
Yes,
after 9/11, President Bush said you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, and these
right.
guys have been hosting Hamas in their capital for since when 2010? I don't know the date. What
Yeah, 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 something like that.
15 years
Look,
hosting Qatar, hosting Hamas, and it seems like we'd had plenty of time to tell them, you know, we won't
to get
tolerate.
rid of them.
Yeah, we get
Look,
rid of them,
we
or we're going to move the base over to
we
UAE and point the missiles at you.
look, Israel made the exact same mistake, and for the exact same reason. There was wishful thinking, and here I'm going to lay a good deal of it at Netanyahu's doorstep, not entirely, because there was a lot of support for it around. It was very convenient to think it's all about economics. And this was a thing about Qatar, and it was a thing about Hamas. And here, frankly, Netanyahu is an economist. He's a free market, what we would call right-wing economist. But I'll let you in on a little sociology of economics secret. If you take, and I'm going to do this sort of schematically, if you take the two poles of economics, of modern economics, you have Karl Marx on one side and Adam Smith on the other. What do they have in common? And the answer is they both believe that economics is what drives people's thinking and behavior. Whether you're from the Marxist end of it or from the free market open end of it. We know that that's simply false. Economics is a factor in your decision making, but if economics were what drove my behavior, I wouldn't be sitting where I am right now in the Galilee.
Right.
You know how you make a small fortune in Israel, right? You start out with a large fortune.
Right.
And if it were purely economics, and we know it's not. What about ideology? What about religion? And I'm not talking about here radicalism. I'm talking about what makes us do what we do. Right. It's not purely economics. By making it seem that it was, the whole decision making was skewed. The Hamas leadership wouldn't do October 7th because it would potentially hurt them economically. The Qatari leadership is going to keep everything under wraps because it's all about economics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we know for a fact that's simply not the case. But I don't think that has completely worked its way out of Western thinking. It has out of Israeli thinking to a great extent, but Europe and the United States are still, well, and Trump in particular, economics. That's what it's about. And it's wrong. It's simply incorrect.
Very interesting. Yeah, because there's a lot to think about, and thank you for that. I want to, I think, shift gears a little bit and talk about Hamas itself. What is next, or what are you looking for here? You mentioned probably not too much of a connection right now between commanders on the ground in Gaza and the Qatari office there, the Qatar office for Hamas. Right. But is there perhaps more leverage on them now to release hostages? Not really. I know last time we talked, I think I could characterize you as among the pessimists on the hostages, right? I mean, it's just, and I think a lot of people that camp is growing. I think a lot of people seeing how are you going to get them to release the last remaining ones when they're Hamas's only insurance policy. It's really the only leverage they have left. Right. But does this change the calculus at all for hostage negotiators?
No, I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. Once again, the public statements, particularly as spun by the media, give a picture that is very different from the reality. And I'll just give you some indicators. Even just before the strike in Qatar, Hamas was mumbling things like, well, we're willing to negotiate a framework over releasing all of the hostages, but we don't know where all of them are.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In other words, it was kind of a yes, repeat, no kind of an answer, which fits. Unfortunately, this is one of the many things where I say, I wish I were wrong, but fits into my sense that they are willing to say, okay, we'll give them all back, but we don't have them all. So we'll give you back the ones that we have, and we'll keep looking for the 5, 6, 7 that we don't know where they are. Stay tuned. Now, what does Israel do under those circumstances? Question number one. Do you say, everyone, hand them all in or nothing? And Hamas says, well, we can't hand them in because if we don't have them, and we can't look for them because you're operating in Gaza. So how about if you pull out of Gaza, give us free reign, and we'll find the other ones, and then we'll come back to the negotiating table. Okay, now what do you do? So that's problem number one. Number two, despite the media spin, we were not one step away from an agreement. Hamas was at the stage of saying, we agree to discuss, agreeing to discuss a framework within which we will negotiate over a hostage release, an exchange and ceasefire and so on. In other words, it's still a very, very long way. And by the way, the guy who pointed that out was President Herzog. And once again, as I said earlier, I put a lot of weight on what he says because he has no political axe to grind in this. Even if we were somehow what is called close, and here I'll throw in some of my experience of both in negotiating and in teaching negotiating, there's no such thing as close to an agreement. It's binary. You either have one or you don't. And there's a very well-known and well-used, and it's very common in the Middle East, negotiating technique to get all the little stuff out of the way and make it look like you're really close. We've got 99% of the issues closed, except for the central one. And, come on, just compromise on this one last one. Dennis Ross wrote about that in his book on the negotiations with Arafat called The Missing Piece. And he said every time we came close, he took a step back. Of course he did. People who want a deal come to a deal. People who don't will continue negotiating ad nauseum. And there's always another. We're almost there. We're 99.9% of the way, except paragraph 2 we need to reopen, and we've got this one final sticking point, etc. And Hamas are experts at that. So I don't think we're any closer or we're any further. I am of the belief that military pressure brings them closer to the table. And here I want to be very clear because it's another one of those mix and match, bait and switch discussions. I don't believe that we're going to rescue hostages by military means. I don't think we're going to see an Entebbe kind of operation, mostly because they're not in the same place. In other words, to launch 20 different operations simultaneously is a virtual impossibility. So it's not that. We may stumble on one and we may be able to rescue one or two, but that's not a strategy. Pressure, on the other hand, is a strategy. In other words, as long as they feel that they can sit freely and negotiate, they have all the time in the world. Under military pressure, they might, and I want to emphasize might, feel that there's something to coming to terms, giving up 10, 12, 14 of the hostages, and in order to get a 60, 90, whatever day ceasefire, some more breathing space, more recruits, a few more booby traps, and all the stuff that they do. Time is a commodity, and they know how to use it. But there's no indicator. In other words, that could pop up tonight, it could pop up tomorrow morning, or it could not pop up at all. One final point on Hamas, and I think it's important for us to understand, whether it's in the context of the current operation in Gaza or overall. Anybody who thinks that Hamas is going to surrender is kidding themselves. In other words, this war is not going to end with Hamas saying we quit. And that means understanding that victory is going to look either very, very bloody and brutal, or it's going to be some sort of masked, okay, let's quit, and they're going to have a victory parade the next day, even if Gaza is completely and utterly destroyed, a la Berlin 1945.
And I do, and I do want to ask you, what you would do. I mean, if you were, and I know we don't want to. It's dangerous to be predicting things, and But
Yeah, I don't do that.
right, but to the extent that you can, I mean, if you were sitting in the prime minister's office, what would be your plan? And yeah, I know it's not an easy question, but how do you think things should be handled?
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the current operation here, I think that the chief of staff is correct. And who am I to say so? My analysis preceded his public statements. I think that what Israel needs now, for a variety of reasons, including grand strategic, international strategic reasons, is a pause. I think that the IDF is fatigued, manpower as well as equipment and munitions wise. It's why he strongly recommended come to some sort of deal, get as many hostages out as possible. He states publicly that he needs a year to get the IDF back into fighting shape. I think he's optimistic, but a year would be a very good start. And that's why when you were talking earlier about hostages and victory not being compatible, and I said simultaneously, this is really what I meant by that. Step one, for a whole bunch of reasons, get whatever hostages out we can that we can. The ones that we can't, essentially write off, whether it's done publicly or not. And I hate to say it that way, but strategically, there's very, very little alternative to that. We can't have a country held hostage by these hostage takers indefinitely, and that's what they would do. And rebuild. Know that we're going into a large-scale guerrilla war, and we need to win it. And do everything possible to be prepared for that. And I choose a year just because it's the time frame that he threw out. And don't worry, they will give us the pretext to go after them whenever we want. McGeorge Bundy, the American diplomat, referred to it as a streetcar. If you miss one, don't worry, another one will come along. And then go in at our initiative with our preparation and not do it essentially as a response to them. Because frankly, we're still responding to October 7th. And they're setting the terms of the battle. And one of Eliot's iron laws, and you know that I've got a bunch of them, he who sets the pace wins the battle. They have the initiative, and we're giving it to them. By lack of choice at this point, if we're going to go in this way. And I just think it's a bad decision. So the first thing I would do is stop. I would shore up our international position. We've got a lot of work to do there. Or I think that if the fighting were nominally stopped, there are caveats in that as well. But if overall it were stopped, humanitarian aid, which on the one hand is nonsense, on the other hand it's a cause célèbre, as we well know, throughout the world. Get all of that off the table, shore up the position, and wait for them to give us an excuse a year from now, 14, 16 months from now, whenever it is, and then be prepared to go in and do the job properly, as opposed to where I'm afraid we're going now, which is we're going to win, but we're not going to defeat them. They're going to scurry off like the rats that they are into the humanitarian zone. We'll kill a bunch of them, but the organization is going to be destroyed. They have too much room to maneuver.
It would seem the counter argument to that is one that looks at international politics. It looks at Israel standing in the world, and you look at how complicated that is, but then you see a friend in the White House, perhaps a historic opportunity, a historic 4-year window here. And I would think someone in the prime minister's office, probably the prime minister himself, is thinking, well, what kind of support will I have from Washington after President Trump leaves office? And does that argue for me saying, despite the IDF's fatigue, I have to do everything I can in these next 4 years? Do you think that's playing into his decision making? And wonder what you say to that.
I think it's a factor in the decision making. If I look at American politics today, I wouldn't be so confident about anything over the next two years.
Right.
But if your world is coming to an end in the next year, that's not the time to make a heavy investment and make more enemies. Look, the Democratic Party at the moment is lost. The Republican Party is starting to fray at the seams and at the edges. I'm talking about in support for Israel. I think it's pushing a bad hand. And I saw a question pop up: can we shore up our position? Yes, we can. There's a lot of public. The world has a very short memory, and there's a lot of public noise because it's in the news constantly. I don't know if you saw a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the German chancellor made some statement about embargoing arms to Israel, and his defense minister said, "You can't do that. We need them more than they need us." And it's true across Europe. They're embargoing arms. Spain is going to cut off our $300,000 a year arms purchases from them, but they buy billions from us.
Right.
So it's not all one-sided. So you might ask, so why don't we cut them off? Because we need the money. It's a little more complicated than that, but getting it off the front pages would certainly be helpful. And sometimes you need to. Strategy is about making bad decisions, bad choices.
And
no, that's it. Go.
Well, thank you. And we have time for some questions from the audience. If you have a question, please just put it in the chat. And we already have a couple. And I do want to, before we go to the audience questions, I do want to just ask you a little bit more about the hostages, Elliot. And I know, when we were in Israel just now, our students were with you on our second week. We went to the north and you covered Hezbollah and Hamas and the borders. A couple days before, the students must have told you this. We were around near the Gaza Strip, and we visited the October 7th sites. And one of the pretty remarkable experiences we had is we were on kibbutz near Oz, which is one of the hardest hit kibbutzim on October.
Yes.
And our tour guide is a resident, although he's currently not living there. It's still, the destruction's so bad, a lot of the residents are still not back.
Right.
So he's a resident of the kibbutz, a survivor of October 7th. And while he was giving us a tour, one of the kibbutz residents who were held hostage in Gaza, one of the released hostages, came back to the kibbutz for the first time. And our students were on the tour of the kibbutz. We witnessed, one of the kibbutz residents greeting his friend who was a hostage in Gaza, and just greeting each other for the first time. It was this
Okay.
such a human moment of, we thought you may have been dead. You were in the news
Right.
for over a year in the tunnels of Gaza, while you were in the tunnels of Gaza. And here you are in the flesh. We get to see you and hug you and just welcome you back. And it really spoke to the human element of these hostages. And I think it's often misunderstood a little bit in the West, and even parts of the pro-Israel community here in America kind of underestimate kind of the Israeli ethos of, we're going to bring back every single hostage. It's not just some emotional issue or some there's only a few hostages left. It's a true a very important objective for the vast majority of Israelis, and I think justifiably so. So just curious if you can speak to that a bit, and how that might just factor in now, and furthermore, I mean, do you think it's going to be setting in sort of, will there be a pessimism setting in, a sort of some sort of calming down of the protests, where people kind of say, well, what how can we give the prime minister a little bit of a break here? It's not like it's easy to get them back, right? Yeah, I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
Okay, look, the demonstrations are essentially fueled by four different, I'm going to call them factions, but I'm overstating the organization level of that. There are four different groups. First of all, you have the families and friends of the hostages, and I will not comment on anything they do or say. None of us would want to be in their position. End of story. I could question their strategy, whether it's effective, but not their sincerity, not their pain, not their situation. A second group is the standing anti-Netanyahu group, which believes that every breath he takes is a disaster for the state of Israel. Nothing he does will be right. He hasn't done anything positive ever in his life. He had nothing to do with anything of getting the hostages out, any of the hostages. It was all Trump, even during the Biden administration. He's simply doing everything possible to make Israel the worst possible place it could possibly be. A third group is a far-left anti-war group. They are in there. If you look closely, you'll see their stuff and hear their stuff. They're the ones who are saying, stop the genocide. This is all in the same demonstrations, right? Spinning those last two groups, spinning ridiculous slogans like Bibi, by launching this operation in Gaza, is endangering the hostages and our soldiers. Every soldier who falls is because of Bibi's blah, blah, blah. It's like, excuse me, that's soldiers fight. Armies go to war. It's a good idea. It's a bad idea. The soldiers themselves are not a consideration in decision-making, not as individuals. Sorry, I still wear a uniform. When I put it on, I'm just a cog in the machine. It's not what my family thinks, but that's just the way it is. The fourth group are the well-meaning joiners. The ones who are, of course we want to bring the hostages home. Of course, by the way, everybody wants to end the war. Everybody in the country wants to end the war. The only question is how and under what circumstances. Okay? But just like the word peace is a magic word in demonstrations, how can you argue against peace? Bring back the hostages is a magic word. How can you argue against bringing back the hostages? And you've got sort of that group as well. If every last hostage were brought back, the demonstrations wouldn't stop. They would shift. They would come up with other topics. They might not be as intense. They might not carry as much weight. But as long as this government is in power, there are going to be vocal demonstrations against it. And by the way, the next government, wherever it is, whatever it is probably going to have loud demonstrations against it. Maybe very, very different people if it's a different government. That in and of itself doesn't particularly concern me. As if righteousness versus the evil of the government does concern me, because that kind of polarization is terrible for the country. Let me just add, as a last but not least, we're in the process of calling up reserves now with the operation in Gaza. The response to the reserve call-up has been significantly better than what was anticipated. Okay, in other words, there's still a sense within those who serve, obviously not everybody, but a sense among those who serve that there's still a mission that needs to be accomplished here.
Let me go to the questions from the group. David, thank you for your question. And we'll go back to the geopolitics and the wider Middle East with David's question, which is, he's curious, what is the true relationship between Qatar and Saudi? And what about with Egypt? And what about with Jordan?
Okay, so the short answer is I don't think anybody knows. Saudi and Qatar are close. They have common ideologies. They have certain differences. Jordan is a very interesting situation because the Hashemites and the Sauds, the Wahhabis, are natural adversaries. They have been for centuries. And Egypt as well. Sisi is dancing on a very, very sort of thin dance floor because Qatar supports the Brotherhood and the Brotherhood opposes him. So I don't think we're talking about deep love friendships here with Jordan or with Egypt. On the other hand, let's keep in mind that identities are, how can I put this? Very often a group identifies based on what they have in common against the other. In this case, the other is us. What they have in common is that they're Arabs. The Gulf Council has its own, the Emirates and those guys in Qatar have their own kind of organization. The Emirates and the Qataris don't get along. But on the other hand, there's a mutual sort of defense idea that if one is attacked, the others are threatened. And that's part of what Qatar used in calling the summit. You've got a Muslim factor, which brings the Iranians, the Turks, the Pakistanis, the Indonesians, and all of them in as well. I don't think that in many of those cases, I don't want to say any, we're talking about deep love or friendship. We're talking about more alliances and relationships of convenience. And here I'll tell you something that I know for certain, and that is that Egypt feels very secure against the mess of what's going on in the Syrian, Iraqi, Turkish, Iranian, Jordanian front, and there's a lot going on all up there because Israel's blocking it all from them. So on the one hand, they can scream and moan about Israel and Israel and Israel and Israel, but they certainly want a strong Israel to hold off the hordes of what I call Mesopotamia and keep them from getting to Egypt. So again, there is an alliance on a certain level, but it's not a deep friendship.
As a follow-up, earlier in the conversation, you said you'd like to see Egypt being the mediator between Israel and Hamas. Why is that?
Because Hamas is brotherhood. The Egyptian government is anti-brotherhood. Now, that doesn't make them the enemy, but it makes them a much better mediator from our perspective than Qatar, which is part and parcel with Hamas. The Egyptians are not close friends. We have a peace agreement with them where they're not close friends, but we have much more in common in terms of defense interests and security interests than we do with Qatar.
I'll ask you one last follow-up, which you mentioned a minute ago, the common defense of the Gulf. And there's a certain intersection there of interests between the UAE and Qatar. Abraham Accords just had their 5th anniversary. UAE did condemn Israel's strike in Qatar. Are the Abraham Accords in jeopardy at all? Is that a consideration? Israel's relationships with the Emirates?
I don't think so. Now, again, this is one of these you can't really tell because you don't know where leverage and inertia is going to take you. But my read on it, and then I'll throw the Egyptian and Jordanian peace treaties into the mix as well. All of these accords were signed by the other side because it was in their best interest. Obviously, we went in because it's in our best interest. We're talking about them abrogating, as a possibility. They're in it because it's in their best interest. We would have to do something horrific against them for them to determine that their interests are no longer served by the treaties. So they can posture, they can do all sorts of diplomatic folderol of ambassadors back and forth and calling in ambassadors and giving them dressing down diplomatically and that sort of thing. But the two factors that I would say that are going to keep the accords going. One, as I said, is their own best interests vis-a-vis the accords themselves, and the second is America standing behind them. They're all getting a lot from America because of the accords, and I mentioned the group, the Abraham Accords, the Egyptian Treaty, and the Jordanian Treaty, and pulling out of them is going to cost them heavily from an American perspective as well. So. Not impossible, but I don't see this having an effect on it.
Well, thank you for that and for your analysis. Think I want to wrap up and want to just leave everyone with a thought here and a couple of and I guess a couple of plugs here, which is just for everyone on the call. Hasbara is preparing to go to Israel again. We have groups going in December. Elliot, we'll see you there. I think we're confirmed. I hope you're in town. Not
I'm
that this
pretty
is
sure
the
we
place
are, but
to,
at my age, I don't remember. That's why it's written down.
right. Not that this is the place to iron out exact time and details, but looking forward to hopefully seeing you with two delegations of student leaders again
Yes.
coming in December. And for everybody on the call, applications are open and filling up pretty fast. So current Hasbara fellows, please send over the student leaders on your campuses. Parents and new students, please encourage your students to sign up and to apply. All on the Hasbara website, hasbarafellowships.org. And just to close with this thought, Elliot, so much when we talk to you and in person, you typically take us around the Lebanon border and the Syrian border. Here on Zoom, we really survey the Middle East and such an important kind of important part of what we do. We're fighting back on campus against the propaganda against Israel, and such an important strategy, unfortunately, that Israel's enemies kind of came up with a couple of decades ago, is when they realized we should no longer frame this as the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Middle East conflict.
Right.
We should call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so, in everybody's mind here in the West, right, whether it's our professors or the media, they think it's Israel against the poor Palestinians. And what
Right.
you help us contextualize is, well, actually, Israel's fighting a war on 8 fronts. And maybe, can you say Qatar is the 9th front now after this strike, or perhaps?
I wouldn't go that far, but it's certainly out there.
Right, but 8-on-1 is good enough, right? It's not this idea, and this is what you help us do so much, Elliot. It's let's break the narrative that we hear on campus. This narrative that Israel's Goliath and the Palestinians are David, when actually Israel's fighting 8 enemies from 8 different fronts, and Israel is surrounded. And that's an important story we have to tell, and our conversations with you certainly help us tell it. So, thank you.
Always a pleasure.
I'll let you have any last thoughts, Elliot, before we wrap.
No, I think we've covered it rather well.
Okay. Well, thanks again. Wishing everybody a Shana Tova, a good Rosh Hashanah holiday, and looking forward to fighting back together and doing the good work in the new year. Thanks again, Elliot. Thanks everyone for being with us.